everybody, and welcome to our first of this year that I know of, at least, book session with our esteemed colleague and one of, I would say, the best instructors in our program, Thom Kennon, that has been with us for quite 15 years. So, not trying to sound insulting, but one of the seniors in our program. Both in knowledge and experience, and he's done amazing things for the program. I have to start off with that, and has been doing not only the teaching part, but a lot of service activities, and more importantly for our session today, a lot of thought leadership and a lot of productive work in terms of how he sees and approaches marketing, and maybe even broader, how he sees and approaches capitalism, but from a very interesting lens, which we do not discuss often enough, I would say, in the context of marketing, and that is ethics. I personally believe that ethics should be a foundation of any human activity, and that you first have to deal with ethics before you actually engage in any behavior. But it's even more important in context of marketing, where a lot of people outside of the profession, and maybe even some inside of the profession, can perceive marketing as a fundamentally and deeply unethical profession. Because what our goal is, according to some, is to convince customers to part their ways with some of their hard-earned money. And that's just one small part of marketing. Of course, this is something we can discuss a bit more, but unfortunately, that small part of marketing has been a driving force of marketing for pretty much its entire existence. Now, with Thom here today, and he'll tell you more about himself, I don't want to steal that flair. We'll talk about his new book, The Bigger Leap, The Ethics of NextCapitalism, which is a direct continuation of his previous book, The Big Leap, An Ethics of Insight. So I think the recurring theme in both books is clearly ethics, but I would also add that another recurring theme is the leap component. We are trying to move from where we are today for various reasons. I would say that companies might want to move from where they are today because they are not profitable enough, or they are not satisfying their stakeholders, for example, or they're starting to actually worry about long-term perspectives of the policies that they have been implementing for pretty much the entirety of since capitalism existed. But on the other hand, the society itself needs to change something if we want to make sure that we stay a society in the long run. So without me taking too much of this conversation, this is the setup that we're going to have today. I will start off with a few questions for Thom, but please, we want to make this conversational. Jump in at any point. If there is a topic that Thom just mentioned, don't wait for the end of our discussion. We want to make this really a multi-way conversation. You can comment to each other. You can certainly comment to Thom. Make questions that are provocative. Make statements that are provocative. I think part of the ethical approach to marketing is that we should question everything. So Thom, thank you so much for doing everything you've done for us. And now, can you please tell us, let's start off with one thing. Can you please tell us about your background that led you to actually create this specific book that you've created, but generally to go on this journey of thinking about NextCapitalism? What personally, from your experience, is what motivated you to go in this direction?
Well, thank you for the great introduction and praise, Milos. I started out in marketing and in business at the same time. I was doing all sorts of things. I was going to school at night at Hunter at the time. I was still sort of singing in bands. I was working in the village and living the dream. And an ex-colleague from my musical career called me up and said, I need some help turning around my parents' direct mail letter shop. And I said, what's a direct mail letter shop, Robert? And he says, come on out to Brooklyn Heights and I'll show you. And it was, they were PR hacks from his parents from the 50s, and they started this business, and they had some of the greatest clients in the city. They had MoMA, they had Metropolitan Opera, they had all the big unions, they had all the big city agencies. They were doing basically direct mail production. They were doing list management and fundraising and donor management, sending things to people in the mail. And I bet that sounds very foreign to all of you here. So we turned it around. That was my intro into marketing through sort of direct, as we called it then. And then I started out my more illustrious career working for a guy named Roger Craver down in DC. And he was one of the biggest at the time, direct mail fundraising consultants in the world of nonprofits. And he worked for ACLU and Greenpeace and all the lefties. And his counterpart was a guy named Richard Viggory on the other side. So I worked for him and got into the strategy role, and I've been there ever since. I started doing segmentation, audience analysis, and personalization strategy for some of these large nonprofit brands. And then in the very beginning, around 88, 89, I started my own consultancy, my first business of my own, and then turned that into a digital agency in 1994. And I parlayed that into an ongoing relationship with Madison Avenue. And I've been a Madison Avenue strategist working on very large brands around the world in every category. I've been lucky enough for the last 20, 25 years. So I've always been a strategy guy. And to me, the big idea of strategy is insight. And that's what you're on the hook for. And you use research to get insight. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about the value and the nature and the depth and the actionability of insight for a lot of years. And what began as a small spark turned into a zealous career path, because I became the guy on the hook for deeper insight than you might get from other guys that did research. So that started my own digital agency around this proposition, and then ended up, as I say, in and out of Omnicom, WPP, and working for large brands inside of consultancies and agencies, but always the one who's on the hook to come up with something about human nature that the brand maybe didn't know yet, and then to suggest things to do with that insight. And that's how I fed 5 kids anyway, and still have a mild smile on my face around tax time.
So I do have to then ask, how does a person that clearly operated in, when you mentioned Madison Avenue, at probably one of the peaks of capitalist society and capitalist approach, and to be honest, for many years, like marketing and corporations were not very vocal about certain social functions as they are today. Whether they've changed or they're just more vocal, that's a question that we can ask a bit later in our conversation. But how does one operate within that society, but also uses that approach of actually critiquing and somewhat fighting against the corporate greed and the negatives of that? How did you balance those two approaches? Because a lot of the stuff that you mentioned in your book is quite opposite from the traditional approach that how Madison Avenue operated, among other things, or still does.
And I've always, to be fair, I've always been that outsider that they keep somehow allowing back in the room. And I read a book early on, and I've been, my politics and my understanding of social and economics and things like that have been greatly informed by a range of radical thinkers, post-structural philosophy and things like, my students in a room will tell you, I'll bore them sometimes with stories of Gilles Deleuze and Michel Foucault and their concepts. But one book I read about 15 years ago was by Guy Debord, one of the essential troublemakers of the 50s and 60s, the Situationists, and it was called The Society of the Spectacle. And in that book, he details and names the specific reasons for which the biggest problem with capitalism was advertising. And I made it my commitment at that point to sort of remain in the belly of the beast to affect as much change as I could by being that outside guy that kept inviting back.
So fighting from the inside.
Yes, yes. And on the edge, inside, but on the edge.
So now let me move a bit more toward your 2 books. How did you move, and what is the transition between the 2 books, and what kind of continuation of narrative you have between Ethics of Insight toward the whole notion of NextCapitalism? And then later on, you might want to explain to us what you even mean by NextCapitalism.
Completely. Well, about 15 years ago, 15 years ago this past summer, I was having lunch with a colleague at Ogilvy, and she said, I'm leaving, I'm going to take this big job at AT&T. I said, I'm very happy, very, 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 very proud of you. And she said, the problem is I'm teaching a course at NYU and I can't do it anymore. I was wondering if you wanted to do it. I said, sure. And so I came by and visited, and they somehow hired me to teach digital marketing. And that's how I started out 15 years ago, teaching inside this program. And at first I thought I knew what I was doing. I had absolutely no idea. About 6, 7 years in, I realized, oh boy, this is trickier, more difficult, more interesting than I ever could have imagined. So I began a process of trying to get better at it. Then, you know, flash forward to, I guess it was 5 years ago this summer, when a guy named Michael Diamond joined. And for you folks that have only been here for a semester or two, you probably don't know who this gentleman was. He was the previous program director, and a total mensch and a total wise classicist, you know, Oxford trained and a consultant. And he had spent much of his career as a CMO inside and outside of a large company. And he left that to join academia, and he became this inspiration to us all. And one of the things he inspired me to you know, start thinking about was a project that I think he was working with you on, which was developing something called the Center for the Ethical Transformation of Marketing and PR. And I said, that sounds very exciting, and I love that first word. And so I began coming up with ways with which we could do research and teach classes and start publishing. And about 5 months in, he called me. I'll never forget this day I'll never forget this day like any other day in my life. And he called me, and I was at my now wife's kitchen in Philly, and he said, Tom, I got bad news. Because he'd gone off to raise money to fund this center. And he said, we have to lose that word that I know you're so attached to in the name of our center. I said, ethical? I said, Michael, that was my favorite word. Why are we losing? He said, because nobody will take us seriously. And I said, and for my students here probably know that I dropped the occasional, you know, New York slang, but I said to myself, I said to Michael, I said, fuck that. And I'm committed then to do what I'm 5.5 years later, I'm happily in the midst of continuing to do, which was to dedicate the rest of my career to doing 3 things all around proving them wrong. And one was teaching, one was consulting, and one was writing. And here we are, you know, 2 books later, we're working on the 3rd, as you suggest. And in this, what I now got called, it's called the Leaps Project. Thank you very much, Robin and team.
The trilogy of Leaps.
Yes, exactly.
The Leap trilogy.
And so, that's when I doubled down on finishing the first book, and you know, to some of the conversations you and I have had about this, Milos, I was guilty in large part for the first book, and in some small part for the second book, of what I now know as to be almost a criminal incrementalism. I didn't think anybody would believe a book called Better Capitalism, just like they wouldn't believe that ethical is possible in the world of marketing. And so and since I'm the insights guy, and because I believe, as you said, that ethics is everything that drives, you know, shared behavior in a way, in an organization or a country or a family. And so the idea of the big leap being, you know, an ethics of insight gave me a framing. And so I started writing, researching, and developing cases and insights, teaching to them, and then applying them in my consulting world, and then pulling cases out of my consulting world and writing about them and teaching this. So I've been able to pull it off. And here we are with NextCapitalism.
So now, to ask a bit more technical yet maybe provocative question, the notion of insights quite often in the context of marketing implies this positivist approach of believing in one truth and one truth only, like purely from now I'm going to go into what I teach, statistics and data measurement and so on. Generally that is implying quantitative approaches, big data, statistical analysis, surveys, and so on. While a lot of the theoretical foundation for the suggestions that you have within your research is coming from a completely different approaches to science, which are more interpretative, whether it's structuralist, post-structuralist, or constructivist, and so on. which generally rely on a non-positivist approach, where we don't believe in existence of one truth, and we believe in subjectivity of truth, where all of us can have a full right of having our own truth, especially in something that is as fluid as marketing. So how do you reconcile between this positivist approach of insight, which, to be honest, most of the companies are now, this is what they're looking for, that's the type of data they look for, versus the interpretativist approach, which provides a foundation for a lot of theoretical underpinnings, if you're right.
Yeah, it's a fabulous question. It really, and it gets to the heart, I think, of everything. And to work backwards, I'm an absolute relativist, as opposed to a positivist, and that's a very safe place to play, by the way, because as I say to my students sometimes, at the very beginning of a project, there's no wrong answers, right, Kiana? At the beginning of it. But the nature of insight.
They're wrong questions.
That's right.
Arguably.
The nature and the depth and the actionability of insight is what I think drives and animates everything I do. And a great way to understand this relativism versus this positivism when it comes to research and quantitative versus qualitative and insight, and the product, which is insight of this research, of this thinking, of this exploration into the heart of human desire. The way I understand insight is that for 70 or 80, 90 years in the world of marketing, world of advertising, especially in media planning, the insight has been derived almost exclusively from quantitative data, right? And sometimes validated to some degree with some kind of qual. But for the most part, the people running the budgets for research and therefore informing all the strategy, the insights and strategy that comes from those insights, we're investing in quantitative research. And where, as you say, it's absolutely positivist and even using statistical analysis to try to find normative and projective insight, right, about how people might behave if we were to do certain things over others, was all applied in a service where an insight was used, as you pointed out earlier, Milos, to basically stimulate desire. And that was the job of advertising. The job of advertising, as you pointed out, was to get people to desire something that they maybe wouldn't have desired otherwise. To be persuaded, to be convinced, to be reminded, to be. So that's.
Yeah, you don't need marketing for a thing that they already.
Exactly. So, and this is why Guy Debord saw it as the great sinister affect of capitalism. It is because it was predatory in nature. And so in the world that I view my career happening in, and the value that I hope to bring to my clients and my brands and to my students and to my readers, is a completely different understanding of the role of insight, the nature of insight and the role of insight in the marketing, in the businessing, and the producting and the branding mix. So here's the example, and I'll use almost not exclusively. In fact, I'm building it. We're launching yet another consultancy. The world needs another one. Thank you, Robin. I'm going to give it a shot anyway with some colleagues, some renegade colleagues from Madison Avenue, Global Madison Avenue, and I'm defending to them this new model, this large insights model, right? That's what I'm building, and it has a role for quantitative that sparks off an initial query or actually prompting of Gen AI that then prompts a query that we put into our social listening tool, TalkWalker, which then spits out data sheets with links to potential social discourse that we feed back into Gen AI to get even deeper analysis, and then we bring people in to do a qualitative synthesizing of insight. So this is a multi-stack, or multi-realm world of research to get at insight, but a different kind of insight, an insight that is not meant to stimulate desire, but an insight that is meant to serve desire. And this becomes, ethical by nature. This becomes, to some degree, altruistic, but not in the service of, kumbaya, my lord. No, this is in the service of competition. This is in service of being a better business in the form of a better marketing. And so what happens, I believe, is a massive competitive differentiation can be achieved by brands who work with insights that serve desire of the human condition that we solve for with our products, rather than trying to stimulate, superficial human desire to get them to buy them.
Oh, but is there a value being created when you actually create desire and then find a way to satisfy it.
There's a value for the shareholders maybe because you're selling things you might not have sold otherwise. And to me, and one of my classic examples of like, what does this look like? What companies are doing this right now would be, and my students that have had me more than one class will be already kind of bored with keep having one of the hero cases is Milos, the founder and CEO emeritus, now retired, of Patagonia. Patagonia, they do marketing for sure. Famously, they've got, don't buy this jacket. That's one of their big ads that they became known for, which is a little duplicitous.
Especially if you go in any of the bars around 5 p.m. here and see the finance bros in their outfits.
See, but this is how business behavior turns into marketing, because what they did, what Patagonia believes is in what you and I talked about this about stakeholder capitalism, right? And the difference between stakeholder capitalism and shareholder capitalism is pretty obvious to some of us, but actually it's a fine shift in focus, in privileging. Instead of doing what Milton Friedman said, the great founding of neoliberal, the Chicago School of Business, theory on shareholder capital, he said that the moral responsibility of a public company is profit first for its shareholders, right? And along comes, Joseph, Stiglitz that says, wait a minute, what about Keynes? He said, no, our job as capitalists is to build a better world, no? And the last 40, 50 years, we've been following Friedman's advice with shareholder capitalism. A guy like Patagonia comes along and says, you know what? We're only going to hire people that believe what we believe about the world. And this is one of the keys to finding this belief statement or this purpose statement of a company is you hire by it, you train by it, you incentivize by it, you reward by it. And everybody is on the hook for waking up in the morning and acting as though they still believe, in Patagonia's case, that Earth is our first stakeholder, our first customer. And what happens when you hire like that, when you train by that and you incentivize by that, when everybody believes the same thing at a company, which is very hard, all around a single ethical principle and one named purpose, you don't have to worry about competing with advertising against people like North Face, because people are unleashed to do things like a sponsorship marketing director did about 4 years ago when they sent out letters to Accenture, I think, certainly it was Citibank, Goldman, trying to think there was another, I think Exxon, and they discontinued their partnership, their sponsored partnership that had those fleece vests with all those finance pros, because you see less of them now. And they were horrified that, Exxon's like, Goldman's like, what do you do? You piddly ass little Patagonia? Are you kidding me? You're dissing us with this letter? And the press got all in uproar and tried to get a hold of Patagonia for comment, and there was nothing to say. There was nothing to say because all they do is behave a certain way that's different than something like a North Face. And what you get then, Milos, is a business behavior that becomes the marketing. It becomes manifest in the public mindset, in the public centers of desire about that kind of company that believes what I believe, and they poke the bear, and they're trying to save the world. So I'll spend the extra $40 on their vest because mi casa es su casa. They're my guys. So I think this is how it differentiates from someone like a North Face who has to continue to advertise against this if they want to compete.
So I'll use that example and now I'll try to serve the advocate for the other side. Let's say that like Patagonia, in order to care for the environment, their products have to cost significantly more than they would if they didn't care about the environment. So for example, and I'm going to make up, I have no clue how much Patagonia vest costs, and I hope I'll probably never find out.
$190, that's it.
$190. Okay.
$250, my bad.
$250. So a $250 vest that is good for the environment, or a sense it's not as bad for the environment. That's better. It's not good for the environment. It's not as bad for the environment as a $30 vest produced by a company that is not using the best environmental standards and materials and so on. However, finance bros and the similar can afford a Patagonia vest, Yet millions of people with significantly lower income can afford a $30 vest. And this is a specific example, but the same example can be used on a much larger scale when it comes to the use of fossil fuels. And a common argument is we should move to green energy. And it's a very easy argument to justify. In the long run, that's certainly something that we have to do. But if we would move to green energy completely, it wouldn't affect the wealthiest countries that much because they can afford expensive energy. Yet poor countries or even within wealthy countries, certain parts of the population will have a hard time paying $500, $600, $700 for their electricity bill. So how do we balance the two? Caring about all of those people, and to be honest, around the world there are a lot of people that are below poverty line, versus caring about the environment. And where is the ethical boundary? Like, are you ethical by doing just one without actually taking care into another?
It is a super question, and it gets at a couple of different interesting manifestations of a company in times of late capitalism. One is this idea that you become very exclusive, as you point out, and you become aspirational, and you become too expensive for 90% of the people that might need a vest. And two is you say that that's okay because we're premium brand and we'll just acquire the customers who can afford us and not worry about the others. And I don't think they do that. I think what they say is, look, the cost of this exclusivity, this cost of this quality, the cost of these ethics is going to be shared with our customers who can afford to. And the benefit to behaving that way as a customer, and pricing and production and labor practices and ethical behavior beliefs, the benefit to the other people who can't afford this is all the massive money. In fact, they just, Chouinard retired and put all of his shares of the company into a trust that was going to be working to save the planet for the people who can't afford those jackets and for the people who can, in the form of investment in sustainable practices, investment in where the global north has typically outsourced its problems of degradation, of the decline, and of the planet burning down to solving those problems out there. So they're in the business of regenerating value. They're in the business of their ethics powering a redistribution of wealth. So those people who only will now buy, Patagonia, $900 winter coat because they're my guys, is willfully and joyfully participating in this redistribution of wealth. And I think that's their promise.
But doesn't this sound quite a bit like a fairly right-wing Reagan's approach to trickle-down economics?
Interesting. Yeah, and in fact, it's even worse, really, when you think about it, because it believes what neoliberalism believes is that the market is responsible for this, not for those poor dying people, the government's responsible for the not the markets. The markets, will do what they will. Or the lie of supply and demand, of trickle down is that, don't worry, it'll get down there eventually. It's not our problem. No, I don't believe it is, because I believe what it means is that every customer of a brand or a business like Patagonia is an advocate. It is an activist. And I think that that's what they've decided to do. One of the things that's interesting about Patagonia is if you're one of our Wall Street bros and you look at them on paper, they're a sell. They're an absolute mess when it comes to late capitalism's terms and value, because for about, and I think it's true, I think we had a student look it up at the beginning of the semester, for the last 4 years, Patagonia has run at about 1.4 billion running top line revenue. And that's unheard of. Because at that point, you're either a new company growing like mad, or you're an old company on the way down. But to stay happily, productively, profitably, purposefully at 1 billion running revenue for 4 or 5 years in a row is an extraordinarily weird company. And it's because they play by different rules. And they play by the collaborative role and co-creative role that they have in the world. So they take their clothes back and they recycle them for the needy. They do all sorts of exchange programs. They do all sorts of this investment, sustainable practices in their own industry and their own supply chain, or their value chain, and everybody else's. So yeah, it's an anomaly. But I believe it's an anomaly that it becomes a North Star for the rest of us to get us to what I think the biggest leap coming September 2026. which I think is about an ethics of utopias.
So speaking of utopia, the notion or the main word that I would say that is mentioned throughout your book is next capitalism. And is Patagonia, like we've been using that example for a while now, is that a good representation of what next capitalism looks like? And how is that different from the notion of better capitalism?
I think it certainly is. And so, and as I said earlier, I'm guilty of an incrementalism. I'm guilty of a lack of bravery in how I approached the project. When I had that conversation with Michael and I decided to double down on proving him wrong, I knew that the vast majority of my colleagues, my students probably, but it turned out that was not true. But certainly my clients would think I had totally jumped the shark. That what are you talking about, Ken? You know, we've tolerated you up until now. It's insane. What do you mean better capitalism? So I didn't name it better capitalism. And even though that was the first chapter, and that to me was the founding premise, was maybe we can do this differently. And so I brought in cases then, like I've done for NextCapitalism, that were demonstrating, I think, in fact, Patagonia is in the first text, as a good example of what this better businessing that becomes a better marketing might look like. And as I began to write that, as I began to teach to that first book and consult to it, and saw how my students were responding, and I have students in this room that I've already started to grade their first paper for this semester based upon an exploration and an application of the NextCapitalism's insights to their project brand. Well, I started to become astonished, startled, and excited by the response that I was getting from these, stimulating these students with these tales of better capitalism, and now next-capitalism, showed me that I was way underestimating the potential for radical change. And so next-capitalism says there's something on the other side of this current late capitalism that's achievable now. And I believe that the kinds of research and analysis and critique and application that I'm getting from my students in this room and elsewhere, based upon their response to the chapters of stimulus inside of NextCapitalism, proves to me that they're ready. They're ready. Oh my God, there's this latent sense of radical shift, of value making, of ethics that is in the hearts and minds and bodies of these new careerists that we're in the room with here, Milos and Robin. And so I got a lot of faith that they're gonna go out, and as I promised, or I asked them to at the beginning of each semester, go out and help fix this world that you and I broke.
So I'll again ask an uncomfortable question. We've had capitalism in various variations and I guess with some fine nuances for the pretty much 300 years, and it never got good. Why would you believe that it actually even has a potential of ever becoming truly good in a sense of what you're describing as a bit broader mission? It's been responsible for at least several world wars, and
Well, this is
and a lot. It has accomplished some other things. Other people would argue that it also led to the largest creation of wealth throughout history.
but for whom is the important question there?
Well, if you believe in trickle down,
Right.
then for a lot of people. But why would we believe that something is different now, that we can still use the same fundamental paradigm of capitalism, yet make it more efficient in creating good instead of creating accumulated wealth in small sections of society?
This is the question I was fearing and hoping you'd finally get to. Because it's not just incrementalism that I'm guilty of. It's duplicity and ingenuousness. Because I've, from the beginning, never believed it was fixable. I only figured that there was a way to build a bridge from here to whatever was on the other side. And that has been the intent of both our first chapters. That's why the third leap, which is the biggest leap, is an attempt to imagine together with my cases, my research, my insights, and my students, what that world on the other side of late capitalism might actually look like, how it might work, and why it might have a value for the vast number of stakeholders in the world that never were served by regular capitalism. Because I think the fundamental difference is how we understand scarcity and how we understand abundance. Because one of the things about real capitalists is when you use that word abundance, they get very nervous. In fact, they get confused. Abundance. If there's abundance somewhere in a system, a good capitalist says there's a problem. And I think that that's why capitalism will never solve the problems it's created. There's something that is on the other side. And I think it's the careers of these people in this room that are going to help us find it.
So then let me ask, we have quite a few students from China in this room, and probably we could argue that to a neoliberal model, China is offering currently the biggest alternative around the world, arguably a socialist economy, and I say that with big air quotes. It's been operating for at least 50 years with elements of capitalist approaches. It is a market economy to a large degree, yet still dominated in some of the key industries with state ownership of companies. But at the same time, with China, we've seen that their model for the past 50 years led to the largest decrease in poverty and largest increase in middle class in human history, without starting a single external war, unlike what we have in the West. And now the effects of China on, for example, Africa, there are some arguments pro and con, but still, my personal position is it's very hard to argue that it's worse than what Europe has been doing to Africa for pretty much since they've discovered that Africa exists. So even if it's not good, it's certainly better than what Europe is doing. But how do you see this as, because like fundamentally, a lot of the discussions within your book are having still Western-centric approach. Should we even try to evolve this model or start looking into models that exist elsewhere with all their deficiencies? But can we reconcile the two?
It's a fabulous avenue to explore. And my students will tell you that I address this very issue and question on these opportunities throughout the course of whatever course I'm teaching in those 14 weeks. I believe that you and I are old enough to remember. You were still in high school, but there was this time when Western critics, economists, government leaders said that what was going on in probably, I would say, oh my God, post. Trying to think who the premier would have been. Post Show and Lie. What we saw in China was something that the West referred to as capitalism with Chinese values.
And Chinese would call it socialism with Chinese characteristics.
Yes, exactly. Right. And to both of their observations, I believe that there's not. You don't have to be you don't have to be too observant to scratch a little on the surface of it now and see that yes, there's a socialism sitting underneath that. Certainly not communism, I would say, but underneath the socialism is Confucianism. I mean, there's something inside of the culture that believes more in the value of the shared commons that I think and ethics than the neo-colonial settler colonizer extractive predator engine that's been driving capitalism in the West for the last 500 years. And so I think that, and I only half kidding will tell my students that 15 years from now, and by the way, all my students and all their projects, I encourage and allow them to bring in Chinese companies, to bring in Chinese social networks, to bring in Chinese technology, to bring in Chinese ethics, because I do believe that, to your point, the reason that China's version of late capitalism has produced the distributed wealth and the general common good and abundance that it has to do with its lack of investment in war. And if you look at the Middle East right now, if you look at the history in South America, if you look at what's going on in Ukraine, you look at the business of America and thus its Western allies has always been war, because war is good for business. And war is at the heart of empire. War is at the heart of settler colonialism. War is the heart of predation, extraction, appropriation. So anyway, to me, China did such a brilliant strategic idea. They said, well, if we don't invest in that, how much does that leave us to invest in other things? And so even if you look at their neo-colonial movements in places like Africa and Madagascar and Asia, you won't see war, you will see business. And you will see products, and you will see wealth, and you will see some forms of abundance that the West is absolutely confounded by Africa. You know, the only thing they ever understood how to do with Africa was to exploit it and colonize it. And then when they got kicked out and that project ended, they're like, what do we do? One of the things that I'm doing with my colleagues now in this new consultancy is purposefully trying to focus on what does this next version of the world of business look like in places like Africa. So I think that there are these two great, hegemons at staring across the globe at each other, and China's one in the West, led by the U.S. is the other. And I do believe, if things break in a certain direction 20, 30 years from now, we'll be trading in yuan more than we'll be trading in dollars. I don't think that's a bad thing.
Well, the newest, speaking of that, the newest proposal by one of the candidates is that any country that drops trading in dollar would actually have 100% tariffs for all imports as part of the protection of.
Not like 100% tariffs to chill the conversation.
So the way that you describe it, it is almost moving into a cultural. A part of the approach, how we should do things, and it's more anthropological than necessarily economical or business focused. So that perhaps the difference might be a shift from individualism toward collectivist spirit, even though we have to recognize that individualist spirit that has been part of the, for example, Scottish traders that kind of invented the capitalist liberal approach were fundamentally Protestant and individualist, and that created a lot of innovation, created a lot of movement, and led also a lot of people outside of poverty. Like, we have to be honest about it as well. But in order for change to happen, whether it's going to be individualist or collectivist, there has to be some type of we. Who are we?
It's a fundamentally important pivot question, really. So it's very interesting. This has to be the focus of the third volume, which is this: who are we? I believe, and you mentioned culture, and my students again will tell you that I'll bore them over and over and over with this idea of drawing this circle that is culture, the culture of influencers, the culture of young parents, the culture of car buyers, the culture of activists. And inside of that culture, there is an identifiable zone of desire that we need to name and then figure out how our products and our business serve that desire. So that's the fundamental logic of what I believe underpins this new businessing. But what I do believe is true, what that only accounts for is this idea of culture. I do believe that there are, and I don't think that there's too much of an argument here, there are only two realms. There's culture and there's nature, right? And I think that if you look at what's happening with the world, the world of nature, it's not hard to realize that the greatest crime of capitalism, of 500 years worth of capitalism, has created this extraordinary imbalance between the two, between the nature and the products and the essence of culture and nature as it sits. The world will still be here, even if capitalism and we destroy it in 700 years, 600 years. Some kind of world, physical world, will still be here. Nature will soldier through. It may have half the species it now has, and it probably will. But species are very resilient, and new ones come around, and things like that happen. I do believe that our focus is, and this is the framing for the biggest leap in ethics of utopia. The focus needs to be this bridge or this place that we hope to define and get to and reimagine and build with your careers here, has to account for the relationship between culture and nature and a business in it. And I think the business has to honor and repair and remediate its relationship with culture and then with nature, and it has to turn and double down towards its understanding of how to act with massive, collaborative and co-creative and ethical horizontalism with its customers, with its stakeholders, whether those are people, the kids that are picking cocoa beans for my chocolate, or whether those are people picking up the garbage that's not there anymore because now I regenerate and recycle everything. So I think that the framing for the next book gets at this idea that you suggest, which is the answer is in there in culture and in business's relationship to it and nature. And I think the two framing concepts that I'm started out with anyway, as I start to write the third book, are this idea, these concepts. One is I got from Marcello Tari, who wrote a book called There Is No Unhappy Revolution. What he means by that is, although they all fail, where the people who are in it experience these moments of untrammeled joy. And I think that that's what he's getting at. And he introduces us to this idea of what he calls, it's a strange word, destituency. And destituency is a form of both resistance and refusal. Remember the great Melville, or Bartleby, right? What does Bartleby do? Anybody know this short story by Herman Melville? Bartleby puts down his pen one day. He's a scrivener. He records things, documents down on Wall Street, right? Written in 1860, right? And Bartleby says to his boss, "I prefer not to." Boss says, "No, we got all these things you got to write today." He goes, "Boss, I prefer not to." So that's what Melville was trying to get at. Well, what would happen if we would prefer not to? If we were to resist and refuse, or refuse without even resisting, because refusal itself. So I think this idea that I get from Tari about destituency is an animating principle of how we start over. I'm also going to try to inflect and inform almost everything I can, all the cases and all the concepts and all the insights that I can conjure in the final volume of the trilogy, based upon a framing that insists on reaching back into what some authors call indigenuity, and this is about indigenous framings. Now, I don't say indigenous wisdom because, like, the good relativist I am, I don't believe that wisdom truly exists. I think ethics exist, and they're a test of other people's wisdom. But I do believe that this idea of reaching back, one of a great example, and I'll pause and take. I think we want to get some questions from here. One of the concepts and one of the cases inside of the third chapter that many of my students just submitted their first paper on is the chapter in NextCapitalism is called "Battle for the Commons." And it makes this case, by the way, for a guy named Morton who came over here. He was a trapper, right? A Scotsman, like you just alluded to, and he goes a different direction. He embeds himself with the indigenous in New England, so-called New England of the late 18th century, and he befriends and becomes working with and living amongst the indigenous in the Northeast United States, and he has this whole different relationship than the Puritans and all the other capitalists that come over who have a very antagonistic but customer relationship with these guys. And he changes the whole understanding, at least for a brief moment, about what's possible if we begin to behave more like them than ask them to behave more like us. And so what in this commons, which, by the way, Aaron Swartz was fighting for when he tried to free data inside of his guerrilla open manifesto, and by the way, the people of the free and open software system are all aiming for is to free data, to free value, to free each other into this commons is utopia, and it's not. Doesn't have to wait for tomorrow, because every single one of the students that investigate and research this particular chapter, Battle for the Commons, says, "But wait a minute, Wikipedia is a commons, and by the way, we've got and the World Wide Web, as Tim Berners-Lee imagined it, was a commons, and it has been corrupted and co-opted completely. So the commons, I believe, is latent amongst us, and I believe that the job of the biggest leap, the job is to imagine and unleash that commons waiting for us to all share.
Well, hopefully AI will become an open source thing and not controlled by a limited number of companies. But let me just ask one final question, and then we'll leave it to the audience. So a very specific question. So when it comes to your book, what can our students learn from it? I mean, beyond the society and leaders and decision makers, what can our students learn from it, and how how would you ideally see them of utilizing some of that wisdom to achieve some of those noble and ethical goals of changing the society for better, whether it's within the capitalist system or beyond it?
I think again, my students that have had me for more than a couple of semesters will know that I do this little shtick when I say the outcome for our 14 weeks together here, I hope, is that each one of you will come away with a different appreciation for a skill that I think is greatly lacking amongst us all. And it's sort of a strategic it's a creative, it's strategically creative. It's creatively, see, I do that about 5 times until they cover their ears up. And I say, do you see what I'm getting at? And they all kind of nod knowingly. That there is this skill, this third skill that sits between creative and the strategic skill that I'm trying to inculcate, if I can, or at least make available to them to take with them and to refine as they go into their careers, because I think it's needed. And I think it's missing in the world of business, in the world of branding, world of producting, world of marketing, which is people. And it's not like, Renaissance woman, or it's not like Michelangelo, not like Da Vinci. It's something different, but it sits in between this joyful, open, curious, and empathetic expression of something that feels like strategic and creative thinking at the same time, but it's something different, and it's something missing, and it's something needed.
Excellent, thank you. So let's start off with a few questions, but before you do that, I just want to say that one thing that we've been using in our program that Thom has created, and I think a lot of the stuff in his books is building upon the notion of data-driven and human-centered. And this is a slogan that became also an unofficial slogan of our program. And I think it's one of my favorite ways how to describe, I think, what a new marketing should be about. So does anybody have any questions for Thom?
Yes.
Hi, my name is Rika. So I think this conversation is greatly surrounded by the topic of ethics and tech capitalism. So if you look at the companies like Uber, SpaceX, Wikipedia, WeWork, they all perform badly on their financial performance at one point or other, announced bankruptcy. So and Wikipedia yesterday, they even asked me for donating like $2 because 70% of the user won't donate anything to them, and they're gonna be broke at one point. So I'm just wondering, like from a business standpoint, how do you like balance between being ethics, basically like making money or making contribution for the society?
That's great. Did you say the Wikipedia?
Wikipedia is non-profit.
Yeah, it's non-profit, but so I'll give them a pass on that. But nonprofits need money as well. But so Uber and WeWork were 2 of the examples. So these are classic examples of what we now know of as platform capitalism, right? And which is a relatively recent innovation, right? I mean, for millennia we had markets. Literally physical markets. We had the Silk Road that ended in Constantinople or whatever it was, and it began in far east of China, and there were markets all along the way and trading posts. So we've had markets, but platforms are unique in the form of capitalism, because instead of having making stuff over here and selling it over here and making a surplus on the cost, we have these platforms which are value is only ever created when 2 or more actors come together. Outside of the owner of the platform. And so there are extraordinary efficiencies that are available to the platform owner. And Uber is a very, very, very strange and anomalous example of how late capitalism and platform capitalism combine to form this hallucination. So the idea that Uber is struggling and finally their stock price is crashing, it was always going to happen. Because it was always a house of cards. It was always based upon profitability didn't matter, at least for the first generation of investors. What mattered was people believed that one day Uber would run everything. Uber would own all transport. Uber was, Uber was everywhere, and my dollar invested now would be worth 100. And so the idea that that's finally collapsing as the pyramid it was is heartening to some degree. WeWork, I think it's a similar idea, and I don't know too much about the company, but I do believe that their ethics for overgrowth based upon stock pumping. I mean, basically, this is the story. The story is not the company, not its value, not its future. The story is its stock. And so, and you look at Gen AI, or I'm sorry, you look at Open AI, right? And Sam Altman, and he's the latest line in a long line of recent hustlers of platform capitalism, who now believes that Gen AI and his company Open AI, as Milos points out, there's only 2 or 3 of them, and the other ones, Microsoft and Google, the two, are going to own the future of all generative AI and large language models, and therefore,
Scary thought.
what?
Scary thought.
You know, it's completely scary, and it's impossible as well. And that will collapse. It's another con. It's another hustle. It's another. So I think WeWork was built upon the same idea, and I think that what happens, you see with, and I haven't read the trade press on either, the business press yet on either one of those 2 new developments you highlight. But so be it. Don't invest in those kinds of companies. Don't work for those kinds of companies. But as they fall, they create the space that I think we're trying to describe that's available for us to create your careers. Does that get anything close to your answer?
Yes.
You know, an interesting thing for Uber is a similar model without a company and also fully legal existed in Soviet Union. Where everybody that has a car, when they're driving in some direction, people would stop them and they would act as a taxi driver and just pick them up and
That's a common.
and receive
I
some money.
applaud that.
Uber then just made it into a platform and started collecting 30% of top of that. But the model has existed.
There's some good cases hiding back in the Soviet Union.
Well, this was more like out of necessity. It was also illegal to do that, but it was also
the best
something that
ideas
was.
are now.
Any other question?
Kiana, what's your take?
On what particular?
Well, is it just provocation, or is there some heart to it? Is there something you can do with this?
I think there's definitely something that can be done. I think a lot of it has to do with just changing not only the minds of corporations that are involved, but people also have to be led to change. I think corporations have to get back into the idea that they can influence rather than be influenced. That positioning has flip-flopped. So, but yes, I definitely think it's doable.
Do you think it makes you just a little bit braver when you go in those first interviews, when you're a little leaning forward and asking them some questions rather than just sitting there hoping they say yes?
Yes, because I think it gives our generation somewhat of an upper hand as to what is needed for the narrative to flip. Like, I think a lot of what's going on now is kind of guessing, like, oh, how can we get this generation's attention or get them involved without there being like sustenance to those answers that we have internally, because we're living it and we're learning about it. So, yeah.
That's great to hear. To me, this is our job, really. And I see this as my job. My job is to get these people in this room and on Zoom better jobs when they get out. Better jobs that do better for the world, that make them happier and make them, more comfortably wealthy than the other people that aren't in this program. So that really is, to me, that you guys go on these interviews and you ask the questions. Are you the kind of company that I'd like to work for? One of the things I learned about spending all this time with students like this around these questions is inherently they're questioning the validity of these systems. They're questioning the validity of that. Just like Kiana just said. You're like, why would we continue to do this? And to Kiana's point, I think that the employers of these people right here, when they get out their degrees in a year and a half, are worried and nervous about you asking those questions. So ask those questions.
So I have a question for the audience, and Thom could comment on some of your potential answers to this one. Do you personally believe in the notion of next capitalism? And if so, what will you personally do in order to create a better society throughout your careers? Because if you don't make a change, nobody will. Certainly, it's much harder for Thom and I.
Yeah, that's why we're using you. Show of hands, who believes? We got 2.5, I believe.
2.5. Now, for those of you that don't believe, why? What do you do believe in? And nothing wrong with a nihilist approach if you don't believe in anything. Even though, as historically speaking, it did not lead far. One country that was known for a large percentage of nihilists was called Weimar Germany. And an interesting outcome of that was the creation of one of the worst regimes in the human history, which is the Nazi regime, which came out of having a lot of nihilists in a country that was coming out of a devastating war. So as much as I have some appreciation for nihilists in a cynical way, when you have a lot of nihilists sitting in one space at a time, it usually results in very bad outcomes for the society. So what do you do believe in? If you do believe in something, and if you don't, why not? Or do you want to actually make any action to make some change? Do you believe that that's your responsibility, or maybe not?
I think it is our responsibility. And I think the younger generations, or like the generation we're in right now, like we have a really different mindset. So what I think it's going to be difficult is that I think that you need to be at a certain status, like having power, having money to make real big change. Which is also a question I want to propose is like, what do you think we as students or as entry level employees or like, I don't know, business owners, like, what do you think we can do as individuals?
It's a fabulous question. And I think that there's two things you can do. One is that you start your own companies that behave differently. And then that's, but I'm not recommending that first and foremost, because the likelihood of survival and success is minuscule.
Especially if you start to very ethical.
Right, yeah, if you start out all crooked like I suggest. Very, very difficult. But you asked those questions in the beginning. Is this the kind of company that I can work with and have this kind of latitude, this kind of empowerment, this kind of capabilities, this kind of voice? And that should be the questions you ask in those interviews. And so that you end up in a company that's more likely to allow you to express early and often a yearning for a different model and for a different world, for more abundance, less scarcity.
Sorry, do you have one comment?
I was just gonna add, I think one of the other ways that we move things forward is, at least for me, like I think I really believe in empowering small businesses.
Over what?
Small business.
Small businesses, yes, and like putting money back into our communities, because when we stop spending with big corporations, they definitely notice it. So sometimes it requires that kind of protest of
Voting with wallet.
Yeah, just like reallocating our values, and maybe we don't get to take advantage of 2-day or instant shipping, but we are empowering our communities by patronizing businesses that do share the same values, the same morals. And I think our generation is really big on doing that. Maybe not so much our parents are like older, but I think as we become new adults and we're able to influence that generation, that will definitely spark that kind of next capitalism that we're talking about as well.
Oh, I think you're right, Kiana. I see it. I think I told you. I know we're running over. I started teaching capitalism, the course, up at Colby College, undergrad, liberal arts, and as part of their Halloran lab for entrepreneurship. And I'm seeing just what Kiana has described. These startup people, men and women, young men and women, 20-year-olds, with their own brand, with their own company, with their own startup. And it's with the massive long shots. But they decided to do what Kiana just said, is they found an audience that wasn't being served in the way that they thought they could be served, and they built a business around it. Now, how many of them are going to survive like 4, 5, 6 years to profitability? Probably very few. But what I think Kiana just described is an energy, a latency that's inside of this generation. I think it's going to do us all very well in our older years, Milos, to benefit from.
Well, thank you so much, Thom. This was
pleasure.
for me a pleasure, and I hope the audience enjoyed it.
Can I ask a quick question?
yes.
Yeah, apologies. Yes, please.
No, that's okay. So I know all the students in the room, as well as the ones online, would love to know when and where they could get your book.
That's a great point. This book right here disappointed both Robin and Milos greatly when I walked in without my hard copy, which was promised to me by my publisher, and they were named. I should have actual hard copies to show off and at least lend out. But I think I'll have 25 of them in the next 2 weeks. but they've been saying that for a little while, but I will have that. But the book is available actually, is there a link in here? We can post a link to the show notes, as they say on podcasts. But we'll definitely post I can give you a link and we send it out.
Yeah, if you could give me that.
I've got a bit.ly link. It's bit.ly NextCapitalism. And my students know it's there. It's $70, which hopefully in the grand scheme of textbooks is not too onerous or expensive. And it's available. And one of the cool things about the book is it actually the assignments are baked into the book, so it's part of the learning experience, and the reading experience is the engagement experience that I have with the students, which is pretty cool. But thank you. Bit.ly NextCapitalism.
So we will share it with
Yeah,
everybody
we'll send it to everybody.
that was here today, but we should share it with students in our other class.
Cool.
Well, Thom, again, thank
All
you
right.
so much.
Thank you
And
so
let's
much.
get big round of applause.